All right, we're just going to go ahead and get started. Even though it's 1 minute early, I want to make sure that we give our presenters time. It feels like we're all the presentations with technology issues have been a bit of a time crunch. So get going here and welcome everybody to the Rangeland Technology and Equipment Council Symposium. If you're not familiar with the group, it's a loose affiliation of people that are concerned about equipment and technology issues on rangelands. And this session's lining up to be interesting, a really good one. I've been surprised that this topic hasn't come up in other sessions, I'll be honest. And I think there's a lot of interest there. It's displayed by those in the room. A little housekeeping things for the presenters. We're on 15-minute blocks. I do have some signs. Thank you, Bill, for indicating 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. If you can leave a minute or two at the end, I will stand up when there's like 30 seconds and I'll come stand next to you. And if you get going too long, I might give you a shoulder rub. I don't know. I won't stop you, but I will definitely make you uncomfortable. So yeah, anyway, like I said, we've got a really great lineup of speakers, just really, going through this discussion of outplanting technologies using live plants out in restoration settings, and going over what it takes, the logistics of how to do it, some of the thoughts and that you need going into this, as well as some of the sciences and technologies. And I really appreciate those that have been willing to share their expertise in these fields. And so with that, these QR codes. We would like feedback on each year at SRM. We do one of these sessions, and we'd like is on what topics will be for next year, and that's what this RTEC survey is. And we'd also like to use this as an opportunity to start to network on this important topic of outplanting and getting this at larger scales across the landscape. And so the second survey is about interest in that and some of your thoughts along that, as well as providing contact information and willingness to participate going down the road in those settings. So trying to not take up too much time in the session itself doing that, but if you wouldn't mind doing that. I've also got some paper ones. If you're technology adverse, back on that back table, there's some paper ones you can fill out and just leave them there and I'll pick them up. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Pellant and Nancy Shaw to discuss a really important person to RTEC. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we'd like to kind of recognize Steve Monsen's contributions to RTEC, as well as his contributions in the Intermountain area in the realm of restoration. And he passed away last summer. I'm going to first just very briefly talk about the origin evolution of RTEC. RTEC, we started in 1946 with the Forest Service, who looked at reseeding and equipment. And you can see in the upper 1951, that's one of the early Forest Service drills. But it evolved over time to the Vegetation Rehabilitation Equipment Workshop, and then finally back to the Rangeland Technology Equipment Council. And just real quickly, what our goal is, and then these are the areas that we've focused on over the years in RTEC in terms of our annual meetings. Well, Steve was a very important contributor to both the Vegetation Rehabilitation Equipment Workshop and RTEC. In VRU, he was everything, seed harvesting work group. He was chairman, produced over 40 technical reports. RTEC, when we transitioned to that in the early 90s, he led that transition and organized and chaired these workshops for 25 years. He was always a part of that. But he had many other contributions. I'm going to let Nancy kind of talk about a few of the other highlights of his career.
Thanks, Mike. Steve began developing his knowledge of vegetation very early on while working on the Wasatch Mountains, herding sheep in the summer times. He had quite an amazing memory and very good observational skills. So I knew I could always call him up and ask about a certain plant and get a long, detailed discussion of it. And it sounds like some of you have done that too. Okay. He began his professional career with the Utah Division of Fish and Wildlife in Ephraim, Utah. And there the aim was to develop big game habitats. So he was working with developing native shrubs for use on habitat areas. Then in the late 1960s, he moved to Boise, Idaho, and worked with research on a watershed project there that was looking at severe erosion problems caused by construction of logging roads in the batholith. And then this expanded gradually to include mineland revegetation in southern Idaho and the surrounding states. Then the shrub project in Provo was initiated in 1975. Steve joined that early 80s, moved down to Provo. And while there for the next 20 years until he retired in 2002, he worked in close collaboration with the BLM on the projects listed here, all of which were led by Mike. And they were developed due to the increasing problems with cheatgrass and wildfires in southern Idaho and across the Great Basin. So what was Steve's legacy? I think in addition to his many accomplishments, some of which I've listed here, it was his passion for conserving and protecting and restoring our Western rangelands, and also his boundless energy and enthusiasm and collaborative nature. He was always working with people on their veg problems, organizing huge conferences or field days with maybe 20 or 30 pieces of rangeland equipment and experts there to talk about them. No small task to set those up. After his retirement, he continued to be active, working on various projects and generating new ideas. And as you can see in the lower right picture, he continued to participate in field projects and conferences for many years. Mike sent me this picture, and I think it very well describes Steve's outlook: build upon the past, move forward in the present, and anticipate the future. So thank you.
Yeah, Steve was a great mentor to me, and I definitely had some of those conversations as well. Corey Gucker is going to present just a brief overview of the equipment catalog. That's a great resource, so go ahead, Corey.
Okay, for those of you who don't know me or maybe just haven't ever seen my face, I'm Kari Veblen, and I work with the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. And at Nancy's prodding, I've been also working on the revegetation equipment catalog with a lot of her help, of course. So we have done a lot with the catalog. Primary accomplishment is that we took it from where it was as a Dreamweaver website. It now lives in a WordPress platform, and it's hosted by the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. So we've retained all of that content. We also reviewed most of that content, not updated all of that content, but we made sure that all of the links are working, internal and external links are working. We've also added a lot of resources for more information where you can go. We've also added the appendix. Let's see what else. So like I said, the website pretty much preserves the original structure of the catalog. The main menu items are what were originally chapters. And then all of these have drop-down subcategories. So we break down the information a little bit more. And then you find the equipment within the appropriate subsection of any chapter. What you see in bold here are wish list items. We've started a couple of them. They're incomplete, but we think they deserve a spot there. And they're also part of this wish list that just continues to grow, and we kind of need to prioritize that and figure out where we are. And that's why I'm here, because I'm not the expert. It's all of you that are the expert. I can do the writing and I can put it on the website, but I need the background, and that is coming from you guys. So this is just a walkthrough of the setup If you were on the main website and you clicked into seed technology, there's a whole section on seed cleaning. This just walks you through where you go. So I just clicked on air screen separators. You get a description of what that is, how you would apply it. And then you scroll down further, you find the vendors, and all of these links are now operational. They will take you to the company website. There's photos. There's additional, like I said, the references and additional information if you need to go further. And then anything in blue means that I found this publicly available. You can click on it and be right there. So I sort of already told you that while we've got it in a great place, it really needs updating. There's a whole lot of sections there's equipment that may even be obsolete on there. But again, that isn't something that I feel like I can make the call on. But there's already a wish list that Nancy put together. I bet you'd all probably agree that it's a good one. So it's not for lack of ideas and a path forward, but I think it's a path forward that we need to talk about and agree upon. So that's sort of where we are now. How could we do that? At minimum, you guys can I'll show you my email. I've got flyers here for the catalog, and you can send me information and I'll make sure it gets on there. But I think it needs a more well thought out plan forward to be good. And I haven't mentioned yet that because it's on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, there's Google Analytics involved with that. So I can tell you that in the last year, it received 3,000 users. And more than 6,000 page visits. And if you dig a little deeper into Google Analytics, it's not that people are just looking at one section of the catalog. They move throughout it. So I think we've got a good structure here. And it would be a shame to not capitalize on this. I think it's a useful tool. And I had one thought, since we're doing a workshop later, maybe we could workshop this somehow. I know the people at the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, we haven't talked about this, but maybe it's something we could support in a workshop way. Or I know it's hard. None of us have the time to add on another thing, but I think this might be worthwhile. So maybe we can have discussions about it in the workshop later, or, just talk to me afterwards or talk to Kevin. So, okay. I told you I would give you my email. Here it is again. Like I said, I've also got a flyer with this information on it, and let's chat. That's the revegetation catalog, everyone.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll just move to our first presenter. Jeremy Pinto is going to be discussing some of the considerations of getting these things on the ground.
This isn't working.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everybody to come to this session. It's good to see some familiar faces. And I appreciate being invited to talk about nursery stock because that's where I work. I'm a research plant physiologist in the Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And I also work on the reforestation, nurseries, and genetic resources team in state and private forestry as a nursery technology transfer person and technological assistance person for nurseries. And today I'm really honored to give kind of set the stage for the rest of the session and talk about nursery plants. Sorry if my terminology is a little confusing. I often refer to what you guys might be calling transplants as seedlings. So if I say seedlings, I'm kind of referring to nursery grown seedlings that are being planted out into the field. So I'll start with that clarification. And then also too, in terms of the technology part of this talk, I'm really going to be setting the stage for how we use nurseries, the technology of nurseries and the technologies of the plant materials we produce in nurseries as an alternative for restoration on rangelands. And so I'll get started. So I often get this question when people ask me about putting plant material on the landscape. What is the type of plant material that is best? And really from a scientist perspective, I always come up with the answer. I'm sure some of you do this too. It depends, right? Depends on the situation. We've kind of come up with this saying recently, the right plant material in the right place at the right time will actually do a good job. And I think for the most of us, we've always experienced the wrong plant material in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the thing about that is that those are really great learning experiences, right? And so part of what I'll talk about today is just, enhancing this learning experience, providing a roadmap for this learning experience so that we can do better for next time in a rangeland context. And so I'll just kind of be setting the stage, but fortunately for me, the rest of all the knowledge and expertise comes behind me in this session. And so there's a lot of great talks and presenters that'll provide some really good detailed information for rangeland restoration. So just to kind of start, general considerations when you start to think about using nursery plant materials is we like to think from a scientific standpoint, but also to think from a managerial standpoint and an experiential standpoint. And some of the general considerations in this context are, the area that's covered, the budget that you have, the timing involved, and the available resources. When I'm looking at some of the stuff that's going on in the Great Basin, this is large scale stuff. And when I think about nursery seedlings, I think, wow, that's probably impossible to do nursery seedlings in this large scale application. So, right, that there's folks who are already doing this, but they're maybe not, we're not thinking in this large scale area. We're actually kind of honing down into more refined areas where we can use this nursery technology in higher priority areas. And so in this sense, I think about, we're using an intensified agricultural process to produce high value plant material. We might focus into areas that where we need some immediate value from that plant material. So I think of high priority areas as some places where we need ecosystem services right away. Maybe we have better control over the biological diversity we can put on the landscape. Also too, from my framework and my point of work, there might be some cultural and traditional needs that we can actually implement in that process as well. Anyways, when I think about doing this, it all depends on your objectives, right? Using your nursery stock for what you want to do. And this is just there's really a lot of different types of objectives that you can use nursery stock for. I could go on and on and on and on about it, but so why use nursery stock in this? I just think of it as another tool in the toolbox, right? There's the right plant material in the right place at the right time. This could be seeds, it could be nursery stock, it could be rooted cuttings, it could be poles, whips, you name it. You can use a lot of different things in a lot of different places. But in my experience and some of the stuff that I've done, when you do use nursery stock appropriately, you can get some pretty rapid results. We've seen some instances where we can get some nice vertical structure right away and ecosystem services and things like physical screening. And then also too, in some cases, you can get plants that are already like bloom and produce seeds and actually start nucleating these areas quicker than seedlings that grow from seed just on the landscape. From a forestry perspective, a range perspective, I've seen those seeds develop and in the first year maybe grow just this much, and then the second year maybe that much. But we're able to plant materials anywhere from 4 inches to you name it, even a lot bigger. And if they live and survive on the landscape, they can become nice structured plants right away, like this picture shows right here. That's a planted seedling. And then a year and a half later, we have some nice sagebrush plants there that are already, some of them are already producing seed. So who's heard of the target plant concept? This is something I love. Target plant concept? No, new audience. Holy cow, 2 people. Nancy, you didn't raise your hand? Okay, so Andrew, a couple people. This is a concept that's really cool, near and dear to me. It's something that was born in forestry, actually. This concept is a really nice roadmap for using plant materials on the landscape in a successful way. This kind of goes away from the idea of this, hey, I need seedlings. I just go to the nursery and get whatever they have and put the seedlings on the landscape, and then whatever happens, happens. Well, usually what happens is it doesn't work. This roadmap actually gives you a process to kind of start to put together all the right pieces to make the right decisions, from human decisions to genetic decisions, to size and shape, to species decisions, to get you to where you need to be. And the cool thing about this concept is that it's a positive feedback process. Well, it's not positive if it fails, but you still learn from that failure and you re-improve your next go at it. And so this takes this idea that you communicate with your nursery, you start at your outplanting site, you look at the limiting factors, all the things that want to kill your seedling. I think I had this conversation with Scott Jensen earlier. It was there's 10 things that want to kill your seedling, but only one thing that'll keep it alive. So, it takes this idea where you start to identify what those things are and try to mitigate them in any way you can. And I think it's one of the things that I'll be talking about basically is using the nursery as a tool to help overcome some of those limiting factors. Okay, so here's the limiting factor slide. This is kind of where I kind of focus in on a lot of research, and this is kind of where that conversation, there's 10 things that want to kill your seedling and only one thing that'll keep it alive. When I think about the concept of limiting factors, and so that is when I'm putting nursery material on an outplanting site, there's a lot of things that want to kill that plant. There's usually always more than one, and the effect is sequential and cumulative, and that's not good. But the take home message is like, oh man, all these things want to kill my plants. But there are some really big things that you can address that will help you lessen that catastrophic failure, so to speak. And so I think, well, there's a lot of things that want to kill my seedlings, and maybe there's more than one thing that I can do to actually keep my seedling alive on the landscape. Now let's start to work through this process and think about what that is. Is it water? Is it herbivory? Or is it soil profile, soil depth, all these things? And now I think, okay, now that I think about what this outplanting site is looking like, now I start to construct an idea of what a nursery can do to maybe mitigate some of these things ahead of time. So stock type choice. Okay, here's some more nursery lingo. This is stock type is a referential term that refers to like the size, the shape, the age, the species of what comes out of the nursery. Now, one of the cool things about nurseries that they can do is they're really good at expressing the phenotypic plasticity of so we can grow plants, as you can see, with just this little sagebrush example, in the same amount of time, but we can make them vastly different shapes and sizes. And sometimes you can express a really high degree of plasticity and sometimes not. So it really kind of depends on what you're doing there. And it also depends on the nursery's abilities. But the key take home is that there's a lot of different types of stock that can come out of a nursery that might help you overcome your limiting factors on the outplanting site. So some general considerations. Again, when you're working with the nursery, part of the target plant concept is talk to the nursery manager, talk to the grower, figure out what the outplanting site looks like. What are your limitations? Now let's start to build this target plant in our mind and what it looks like. Let's leverage the nursery strengths and what they're able to produce to maximize the potential for growth and survival. One of the things that I studied was looking at variable root lengths of nursery stock to kind of get at that limiting soil moisture aspect. That was a limitation on the outplanting site. There's deeper moisture, deeper in the soil profile. Oh, hey, let's grow a seedling with longer roots to access that. Well, they're a pain in the butt to plant, I'll tell you that, but it does work. And then I did learn a tough lesson too, a couple of matched my container depth with the limiting factor of soil depth on my site. It's hard to plant a seedling is a root system this long in soils that are that deep. Lesson learned. But I went back in the feedback process, started over again, and let's design a seedling that addresses that component and still helps us overcome our limiting factors. So, okay, I was going to talk a little bit about stock type studies here, but I think Scott's going to talk about that later. I get this question a lot. So if the nursery can grow a lot of different things, what do you choose and why? And so we can continually do studies here over and over again to try and answer that question. The key is that a good stock type study is really hard to do. So if you're ever thinking about trying to do something like that, you should talk to me first or talk to Scott so that you don't end up with all the problems that I've dealt with myself. I'll move along quickly here. One of the things I mentioned earlier was this idea of like, let's try and get away from this idea of, I need seedlings now, let's go to the nursery and just see what they have and get them and plant them. When we think about nursery stock, we should be designing the target plant. And when we do that, we actually have to think backwards in time to allow the nursery to produce the best stock they can, the most genetically appropriate stock that they can as well. And I think a lot of folks don't think about this timeline. I myself, when I do home landscaping, I need some plants. I go to the store, I buy what I need, I put it in the ground. Sometimes it works, but I give it post-planting care, so I try and really make it work. When we're doing seedlings for this application, it's a lot different, so our planning timelines are not just go to the store and buy it. this timeline kind of shows that for a 10 cubic inch container, we're actually looking at maybe a year process. It takes time to grow that seedling and maybe harden that seedling off. You have to have seeds for that seedling. Well, if you're storing it, what are your outplanting windows? And this will change for the different type of stock that you're looking for from your nurseries. So it could be one growing season. It could be a year and a half, 2 years. The key thing is to kind of keep that in mind, that we don't want this home store approach of going to get our seedlings. Let's try and put a little planning in, because that'll help us increase our chances of survival. I would be remiss if I didn't mention seedling quality. I think this is a really key attribute. Fitness for purpose is kind of what we refer to. And in terms of the target plant concept, this idea is that quality is something that's more physiologically based. It's not how something looks, it's how it performs on the outplanting site. Oftentimes I see some really nice looking seedlings, they morphologically, they're the right height, they have the right root development, but it's really what's going on the inside that really matters. Is that seedling capable of growing roots? Is it capable of moving water? Can it perform well? And working with your nursery to help identify what those high quality parameters are really important. So I think of morphology as a good visual indicator, but beauty's only skin deep. Let's talk about how they were grown, how those seedlings were handled. And let's think about the physiology of how those things will actually perform in the environment that they're supposed to be put in. One of the things that we're looking at in terms of nursery technology is changing our nursery cultural regimes to physiologically condition seedlings for specific outplanting conditions. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Andrew Nelson, will be talking about some of that later, some really cool stuff. But one of the things, again, beauty is only skin deep. I have an example up here of ponderosa pine. And these particular seedlings, this is like some X-ray film. But what it shows is just a really nice cross section of a stem, right? You can't really tell much from that. The seedlings look great. What that little dark ring is showing showing cavitated xylem. And for those of you who know what xylem is, xylem are the water pipes of seedling systems. They are the lifeblood of what keeps that seedling alive. What happened here? Well, we don't know what happened here. These seedlings are going out in the field, and there's already been a catastrophic event where their xylem has been compromised. And so really, we kind of have to pay attention to seedling quality, what happened in the nursery, maybe what happened as the seedlings were going out into the outplanting field, to kind of understand some more layers of how things want to kill seedlings. But again, seedling quality is really key. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about seed use efficiency before I conclude, maybe some time for questions. This is another cool thing about nurseries as opposed to direct seed. In direct seed applications, this is a slide that was put together by a colleague of mine. So there's a lot of numbers there. I think basically what I'll say is that when you're putting a lot of seed on the landscape, you're only going to get a small percentage of that might germinate. The cool thing about nurseries is that we actually have controlled situations, right? So we can take a smaller amount of seed, germinate a whole bunch of it, and produce plant materials I won't do the cost comparison, but essentially the idea is that we're using a lot less seed and we're creating a lot more seedlings from that seed. Now, of course, nursery production itself will cost more money, and I won't go into the weeds on the cost comparison there, but you can see that if we have limited amounts of seed, that this is also a good viable option for seed use efficiency. I know I covered a lot. I went really fast. So if you have any questions, you want to chat with me later. Fires happen in this area, and the turnaround from other vegetation moving in becoming a problem, and that time you need to produce the seedlings to actually get them in the ground, right? More or less, is it really goes away from that approach where I need seedlings now, what's available, how can we address this? And that's a difficult one, I think. Like it relies, so if you're thinking about having a bank of stuff available, that requires a lot of nurseries to grow on speculation. And it's something I really can't comment to with any definitive answer at this moment, other than how do we get nurseries to grow on that speculation kind of area? But I think there's a lot of smart people in the room that are kind of identifying, we're getting these large things, there's potential. It's just Now, how do we cross that barrier with getting nurseries to have that stock on hand, I guess is the question. And it's a difficult one because, well, if the fires don't happen, what do we do with all this nursery stock?
Right, we're gonna move to the next presenter, and that, the capacity and getting more work on the landscape is definitely part of this discussion. And then Dr. Veblen's gonna talk about maybe another way of going about that. So turn it over to her.
Sorry, say again? So this is the arrows. Okay. All right, thank you very much. And thank you to Jeremy for that talk. I have definitely had the experience of trying to wrestle seedlings away from the nursery before they thought they were of appropriate quality. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the establishment of mountain big sagebrush from seedling transplants versus mature plants. And so the first thing I want to do is acknowledge my co-authors, especially Liz Bailey, whose picture is up there, who is the master's student who worked on this project and was instrumental in getting it set up. So just some brief context for my research and for this talk. So one of my preoccupations, like many people here in the audience, is the conservation and restoration of sagebrush rangelands. Value them for livestock production, for wildlife habitat. And of course, there are many threats to these systems. So just a few of them up here, right? We have fire, cheatgrass, juniper encroachment, and of course, drought and high temperatures, and the fact that that's not going to be going away anytime soon. So up on the left there is a picture of what you might consider a pretty typical restoration project, right? Putting a bunch of seed in the ground, praying for rain. And so it's become very clear that this approach is problematic, right? It makes sense in a lot of ways, but there are obstacles to success. And so, seeds, when they're put on the ground, go through a series of filters. And so there are specific research studies, which I have depicted there on the bottom, looking at these transition probabilities across different stages and just general empirical evidence. And then any manager that you talk to can tell you that problems with getting from germination to emergence. So germination, when you, on the far left there, and then from moving to emergence when you're actually popping out of the soil. So in response to this, something that I've been working on in my lab, and something I actually started working on in my later, as I was transitioning out of my postdoc, is this what I've been calling high input restoration. So at the top there, we have these seedlings. And so high input, I mean, there's the planning, right? Ideally a year ahead of time. There's having the seedlings grown in the nursery, and then transporting them to the site, and then you get to the point of actually putting them in. So we have somebody there with a sharpshooter on the left, getting a single plant into the ground. In the middle, we have two fully grown, very able-bodied human beings working very hard to get a single seedling into the ground. So I think everybody can agree this is high input. This is a lot of, it's difficult, and you have to put a lot of energy and costs into it from the beginning. And so a lot of what I have been doing is thinking about, seeds versus seedlings, and then also just working on how to make sure that if you are going to go through this work of putting these seedlings into the ground, that it's successful. Where should you plant? How should you do it? But then a couple of years ago, we got this amazing opportunity to really kick it up a notch. And so this was to compare growing what we're calling tubelings, so these seedlings, to putting wildlings in the ground. And so I'm not talking about these kind of wildlings. I'm talking about these, which are these sagebrush plants that have been dug up with the root ball intact, and trying to put them into, actually get those into the ground. And so we had the great opportunity of being able to get these on site, so just a couple kilometers away. And so people have done some work with this, like with bare root, but a lot of transplant shock associated with being a nice mature plant and being transplanted that way. And then there've been a few studies actually looking at getting these, what we're calling wildlings, into the ground, and with kind of variable results. So the area that we did this was in southeastern Idaho, so at this Fox Hills Ranch. So this is a mountain big sage site, and I've covered up part of the legend there, and hopefully people will ask me about it at the end, but you can just focus on the yellow plots and then the blue one. So the two shades of yellow are tubelings, and then the two shades of blue are the wildlings. And so these are 80 by 80 meter plots. We had 12 copies of tubelings, 12 of wildlings, and then 6 controls. And then within those 80 by 80 meter plots, the sagebrush were planted in 4 islands of 25 plants, so 100 per 80 by 80 meter plot. And so the site was, when we first arrived, was dominated by smooth brome and then also some Poa pratensis. And so the site was grazed and then disked and harrowed and then treated with herbicide, and then a seed mix was applied over the whole area of about 22 different herbaceous species. And so for the tubelings, again, this is a total of 1,200 plants. The seedlings were grown at the North Fork Native Plants nursery in Rexburg, Idaho. They were about 4 to 5 months old at the time of planting. We planted them with dibble sticks and then did not have any supplemental water. And then the wildlings, again, 1,200 of those. And so there was a plant contractors who were instructed to find plants that were around 15 centimeters tall with no evidence of reproduction. And so they were dug up and then wrapped in burlap and then transplanted with that root ball to the site. Okay, so this was a very striking result here 1 year post-planting. So we were surprised that the survival of the tubelings was lower than we had expected. But then what was just really shocking was how high the survival of those wildlings was. And so then we went back 3 years post-planting, and I had to look at this to make sure that I hadn't messed up and just used the same, and not analyzed the correct data. But it is, I did it right. And so you can see that if you survived that first year, for the most part, you were surviving for you're surviving till year 3. And so we had 85% survival of those wildlings. So, the next question is, so what did those plants look like, right? The quality of those plants. So up here on the top, I just have what the heights were. So the top row there at planting, just showing that the tubelings were 12.5 centimeters tall on average, and the wildlings were 14.3 centimeters, so fairly similar. And then by the time we got to year 3, fairly similar in height. But the tubelings were more variable. So, right, we have the heights there on the x-axis and then the frequency on the y-axis. And so in terms of the size of their crowns, so the wildlings that went in were bigger in the first place, and then they also were bigger 3 years post-planting. Okay, but the plot thickens, and this is where it gets really interesting. So at 1 year, we looked at evidence of reproduction, and so it was pretty low for both the tubelings and the wildlings. And then when we went out there at year 3, about a third of the tubelings showed some sort of evidence of reproduction, and most of the wildlings did. And so down there in the bottom, you see a sagebrush, and you can kind of see a tag. That's the one that we planted. And then there are all of the seedlings that recruited. And so we actually looked at densities of sagebrush in these plots. And so we put out belts that went in planted plants. And so we found, what you can see here is pretty similar recruitment for the tubling versus the wildling plots. And then what we did here is I just added in basically what we got in terms of density from the plants that had survived, right? So we basically ended up by increasing 0.08 plants per meter squared by counting the surviving tubelings, and then 0.37 for the surviving wildlings. So in the end, about 0.43 plants per meter squared for the tubling, and then 0.68 for the wildlings. And this is where you can appreciate the title of my slide, the plot thickening. Okay. So to summarize what we found, right? So the wildlings survived better than the tubelings through to year 3. The heights were similar, but the wildlings were bigger, larger crowns, quite a bit more reproduction or evidence of reproduction for the wildlings, but it seemed to be enough for the tubelings, right? So we had similar recruitment. So to circle back to this idea of this high input restoration, something, a theme that comes up when people write about this, when we think about it, is that the idea is if you're going to put in these inputs, if you end up with higher survival with this extra labor and cost that you're putting in at the beginning, ideally, that means you're ending up with a reduced cost per established plant, right? So here are the costs. We kept track of costs for the project. And so that top row is what it costs to get in 1,200 plants of each. So 1,764 for the tubelings, 3,600 for the wildlings. And then below that, we have the number of surviving plants. And then from there, we have the cost per surviving plant. And so you see that the wildlings, even though it's more labor and cost up front, they, in terms of cost per surviving plant, it's about half the cost. But then if you think about, or you consider the recruits that came in, and you just add those, and this is assuming that, we have a pretty uniform density across all these plots, you end up with a higher density of plants. And so at that point, the costs become much more similar between the tubelings and wildlings, and even with the tubelings costing less. So the conclusion from that are that the wildlings are cheaper to establish, but the recruitment from tubelings eases the cost, at least at this site under these conditions. And so I'm actually going to leave it at that. And hopefully during the campfire discussion, we can talk about what all this means for what people might do moving forward. And so I will just end by acknowledging funders and project partners. And if there's time for a question, I'll take it.
We'll move on to Dr. Kirk Davies. He's going to be presenting on what you see there.
I'm really excited to see how full it is on the last day of the meeting. I mean, this meeting has just been packed with people. I think they're saying that some of the best attendance ever. So it's really great. This on presenter mode or just like, okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of my research looking at the effects of microsite location and cattle grazing on Wyoming big sagebrush. And it's actually 2 studies I'm just going to kind of group together for this talk. So I want to recognize my co-authors on this as Dr. Chad Boyd, Dr. John Bates, and hopefully soon to be Dr. Danielle Clinet. So we've kind of already got some of this stuff from the other talks, but I kind of want to go into a little more detail on this, especially when we're talking about Wyoming big sagebrush. Why do we often want to use transplants? And the reason is that Wyoming big sagebrush occupies these really harsh, dry areas, and it's really hard to get it established from seed. Now, I'm not saying we can't do it. We don't do it at times, but transplants are a lot more successful because we can bypass that seedling emergent stage where we lose a lot of seedlings. The cost is greater usually with transplants, but when it comes down to established Wyoming big sagebrush, they're actually oftentimes cheaper. So it's something to keep in mind, if you're like, it's too expensive to use Wyoming big sagebrush transplants, oftentimes it's actually cheaper per plant you get established. Now, that being said, they are expensive and it's logistically challenging to get them out on the ground. One, we have to get the seedlings, but then 2, largely we have to put them out by hand. Though I think we're going to have a talk later today that I'm really excited to hear about using some equipment to plant them. So to help, use these very expensive stuff, we wanted to look at, is there areas to prioritize planting them? And there already is, in terms of like sage-grouse habitat, this or that we're looking at, but within one of these places we've already chose to put transplants, is there better locations to plant them than others? And then one of the big things that I would like to point out that, once we have these transplants established in the field, the biggest threat to them is fire then. And we see this up in the Hanford Reach area. There's been a lot of transplanting going on out there, great success. And then another wildfire comes through and wipes out all their success. And then we also want to encourage their growth. And largely so that they start doing what we just saw on the last day. They start recruiting new individuals to these plant communities. So we don't generally plant transplants at the density we want stand to be in. We try to get them across the landscape that's devoid of sagebrush. So where to plant in a post-fire area? So there's two main microsites out there after you burn a sagebrush rangeland. The dark area you see there, that's where the sagebrush canopy used to be. And then the gray area is the interspace, the areas between sagebrush canopies. Now, sagebrush oftentimes create resource islands when they're growing there. They're pulling in resources, dropping their leaves on the ground. You get more nutrients, more organic matter. And oftentimes that still stays after the fire. There's still more resources in that area. The sagebrush, being a woody vegetation, oftentimes burns a lot hotter than the interspace area because that woody stuff's combusting. It oftentimes results in some mortality of our perennial bunch grasses. It also oftentimes depletes the seed bank. So you end up with a kind of environment that doesn't have a lot of competition, at least the first year or two after fire. So we end up comparing transplanting Wyoming big sagebrush plants in canopy and microsite interspace after fire. And we did this in 5 different ecological sites in Southeast Oregon. And according to the NRCS, that represents about 2 million acres. At each site, we planted 50 cone container transplants in each microsite. And we planted these in the November of 2014. So this graph here, in which I'm really glad to be in this room because some of the other rooms yesterday, it's really hard to see the graphs, but I think everyone can actually see these pretty well. It's percent survival out of 100. So 100% would be every plant lived. And then this is going over the 4 years after the fire. And just like we heard from the last study, the first growing season after fire, we really didn't see, much mortality. But as soon as we went to that summer drought and came to the next growing season, we saw a huge drop off in survival of the ones in the interspace microsite. And from then on to the end of the study, survival in the canopy area compared to the interspace area was about 7-fold greater. So we got a lot more plants growing in those areas, a very different microenvironment in terms of survival. The other really interesting thing is, and as expected, the growth was a lot greater in this favorable microsite created by the sagebrush that had been burned out of there. So we ended up seeing, and this is just cover on the y-axis in the same years, and we saw that even in the first year when the densities were cover was about 6-fold greater in that canopy microsite or former canopy microsite than the interspace. And at the end of the study, we'd reached cover levels in that former canopy microsite of past 15%, where we're still around 3% in the interspace of the few plants that had survived. So very different microsite effects. So if we get these transplants survived out there, fire's a big risk to them, especially if we're going into a community that had previously burned. We generally see an increase in our perennial bunch grass production. We oftentimes see a flush of annual grasses as we got a lot more fine fuels out there drying out early, posing a fire risk to these plant communities. And as we all know, sagebrush is really intolerant of fire. And oftentimes grazing is actually excluded for a couple of years on these areas too. So we run into this buildup of fuel. But there is concerns that cattle, are a very large animal, and them moving around out here, they might be trampling these sagebrush plants and killing them. The other concern too is that these transplants, even though they're not generally targeted by cows, because cows don't consume a lot of sagebrush, they do sample things out there, and they'll sample sagebrush. And a very small seedling, if they sample it, probably would result in mortality or even pull it from the ground. So we wanted to look at that. So the first thing was, we applied moderate spring grazing to these areas. Did it affect the fire risk? And it did. It greatly reduced it. You can see it reduced the perennial bunch grass cover in the first figure there. Just so as we expected, we're removing the prior year's growth and some of the current year's growth, reducing that connectivity of fuel. What's really interesting is you can see in 2018, we had quite the flush of exotic annual grasses in our plots. And the grazed areas had 50% less annual grass cover. And that's a big deal because that's what's really going to put a big risk on these. So across the board, these fuel modifications with grazing reduce that fire risk. What we're really interested in was what was the effect on our sagebrush. We didn't see any negative effects to survival from grazing. The grazed and the ungrazed areas had the same survival. What was really interesting though, is that grazing, by changing that competitive relationship between the herbaceous plants and the sagebrush, favored sagebrush. Sagebrush grew a lot larger and a lot faster with cattle grazed in there. And you can see that from this figure here. The black is the grazed area, and then the non-grazed is the gray. And this is sagebrush cover. And by the end of the study, we had double the sagebrush cover in these areas that were grazed versus ungrazed. Now, the really interesting part that I think is interesting, especially after we just saw the last study about reproductive efforts in these communities, the reproductive stems per plant was more than double in those grazed areas. So we encourage them to grow faster, larger, and start producing seed that would help recruit into these communities. Now, after seeing the last study, I really wish we had spent more time looking and seeing if we got recruitment in there. But in Wyoming big sagebrush, you don't see recruitment nearly as often as our mountain big sagebrush, so we probably need to look at it for like a 10-year period and hopefully see some. But we really see a huge difference based on whether or not these plant communities were grazed. Now, that being said, we were using moderate levels of grazing. We weren't, hosing these plant communities. And I want to be very clear that, that's not the goal with any of this stuff. We're looking at acceptable levels of grazing that just help a little bit with the sagebrush. So really the takeaway points from this study is there is some very distinct microsites out there that can be very favorable for our sagebrush plants. In a former sagebrush community that just recently burned, that microsite where sagebrush had been is the ideal place to plant it. The survival being 7-fold different, that's huge. We were looking at, 70% survival versus, somewhere around 6, 7, 8% survival based on those two different microsites. That's a big deal when you're talking about something that's very expensive to put out on those rangelands. The one thing that it also does is that there leaves us with some concern that if we're not getting sagebrush back into these plant communities that are getting invaded by annual grasses and they're reburning, we're probably losing that microsite, that more favorable one to plant these sagebrush in. So kind of a, a little bit of a warning there that we might want to be on top of getting sagebrush back into these plant communities, sooner than later, especially with the areas that are at risk of annual grass invasion. Grazing can clearly be used to protect that investment. We can reduce the fuels out there. Be great to see some more research on this to expand it and see what, how it varies in other places than just where we did it in Oregon. And grazing can also accelerate that sagebrush recovery. So that's a great way to help us get those sagebrush plants larger, faster, as well as hopefully producing seed faster so that we can get that sagebrush plant community or the sagebrush, dominance to spread across that sooner versus just having a little scattering of individual transplants. And if you guys want more information on it, these are the two studies, and they're both been published in 2020 that I pulled all the figures and information from. And of course, at this point, I'd gladly entertain any questions that we have time for. So the question was in a natural recovery without any, planting or seeding going on out there, a lot of times you see the sagebrush growing in the inner space and not the subcanopy. And I think the reason there is surely the fact that sagebrush, when it burns so hot that you use most of your seed bed underneath it. There's a bunch of litter, leaves, seeds are probably trapped in that. They're probably being burnt out. Now, if you fly sagebrush seed on, you'll actually see most of it that is successful is in those former sagebrush canopies. So they're an ideal spot for planting or seeding as well as planting. So the question was, do we have any herbivory pressure from wildlife? We did not have significant ones in these studies. One of the ones that's been the most damaging to our other studies has been rabbits, and they waste cut those ones. They just cut them right off at the ground and they're dead. A lot of our areas, especially Wyoming big sagebrush, doesn't have a lot of herbivores in it, but they do, have areas where you do have, some at certain times. So it is a risk that you have to worry about. And that's, kind of, especially research, you get in the trouble if something's too small that can be easily wiped out versus hopefully your landscape project's large enough that, patches of wiping out isn't a project being wiped out. Okay, so the question was, what was the season and intensity of use by the cattle? So we actually did spring, early summer grazing, and we I don't have the, cows per acre, but we shot for 40 to 50% utilization, and then we pulled the cows out. Oh, sorry, the question was, did we start out on cheatgrass or not? In the grazed one, we did not start off with a lot of cheatgrass. It was actually kind of one of those communities that went back and forth every year where it had cheatgrass in it. On wet years, it would really, flourish and be a lot out there. And so the first couple of years, the cover was pretty low, and it was more to do with, precipitation. And then 2018, we had a lot. We had more annual grass cover than perennial grass cover. And that was a really interesting year when we actually saw the grazing effect on the annual grasses was huge. But, annual grasses are very nutritious if you graze it in the spring.
Presentation will be Dr. Matthew Madsen. He's going to talk about sort of a novel way of getting some of these things established.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm excited to be here, share with you some of the work that we've been doing. Acknowledge off the bat, this work was led by Holly Lund. She was the master's student on the project, as well as hardworking students like Bridget Calder, Ethan Ostroff, Amber Johnson. And then Kate Rubelman's a contact that's helping us from Rio Tinto Kennecott, and then Brad Geary. So a little bit different subject from what we've been talking about, but thought it'd be good to mention, to sustain our modern world that we have and these fancy devices that is all surrounding us takes a lot of mining. This slide here, says 2.96 million pounds of minerals, metals, fuels. Some is what someone would use in their lifetime. And a lot of that's, sand and gravel, but, things like our mineral component to make solar panels and windmills and things like that, that's expanding now today, ups the amount of mining that we need to do, as well as the batteries to move and transport that energy. So mining's extremely important, and being able to reclaim areas that have been mined is even more so, right? And here in Utah, the Kennecott copper mine has extracted a lot out of it. It's a massive hole, as you all know, if you've flown over Salt Lake City, 1.2 kilometers deep, 4 kilometers wide, and pulled out a lot of copper and other minerals out of that mine. And the Kennecott copper mine has an active restoration program that's picked up in the last 10 years or so. And one area that they're working on is trying to reclaim the rock dumps. So when we say rock dumps, this is where they've, to get to the ore, they've pulled off this overburden, dumped it on the outside of the mine. And if you're looking from the Salt Lake Valley, you see these big rock dumps. And here we're showing one that's being reclaimed, where they'll bring in stockpiled topsoil, mix it with other rock, and then put about a meter deep material out across the hillside that they then seed into. And what's the zone where they're trying to reclaim? So a lot of this is mountain brush. So lots of shrubs, small trees that they're trying to reclaim. And I want you just to look at that. So ignore the students in the foreground looking at a seeding study and look at the hillside there where it's undisturbed. And we see a lot of green vegetation, such as Gamble's oak and big tooth maple, some curl leaf mountain mahogany. And that's important if we're trying to restore the view shed of the hillside. And here I'm showing where they've been doing a lot of the restoration work or reclamation work. And you'll note the bottom part of the hillside there, that's where they've restored it. And what happened with the seeding efforts that have done, they've got a lot of grasses onto those hillsides. And it's great as far as stabilizing the soils, keeping weeds out, a lot of benefit. But in the summertime, those hillsides, they go brown, and then they, for the public, they look like the rest of the mine. So they came to us to say, hey, how can we improve this view shed? And here, just another photo up on the mine. You can see that grass, primarily a lot of that's intermediate wheatgrass that's growing. So obviously to improve that view shed, we need to get more of the species up there that's in the surrounding landscape. But as well, I think there's value in improving wildlife habitat. This is important. winter range for mule deer and summer range as well. So kind of my tribute here, we're talking about Steve Monsen, wanted to put some of his pioneering work that's been up that's really progressed our ability to plant shrubs and on landscapes. But we also were here because it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to get shrubs to grow for a lot of reasons that we've already talked about. Trying to get them to grow from seed is difficult. And now you think about these hillsides, which already have now grasses growing on, and the competition, it would be very difficult to get shrubs to grow from seed. So we thought, well, let's cheat a little bit and try seedlings, get a boost on, as well as we're still concerned, could we even get seedlings to grow in these environments? So we looked to a technology called the WaterBoxx by a company called Oasis. And it's an innovative type technology where it captures rainfall as well as this corrugation on the soil, on the surface of the box, helps collect dew, and that moisture goes down into a reservoir that's surrounding the plant. And then there's a wick you'll see in the diagram there and the bottom of the slide where that allows water to then be released to the seedlings. So it's slowly giving water, and with the idea as the soil dries out, more water is going into the soil to the seedling to help it survive through drought conditions. So we put in a study to see, well, how well does this do with a bunch of different shrub species, as well as it's always a challenge to get out in the fall. You got the short growing window, especially for us in between classes. So what if we could, if we're giving water to these plants, could we plant in the spring too? So we looked at planting in the fall and in the spring. And in doing that study, it led to some other questions too, like with logistics with these water boxes. We always, when we'd go out, we would see water in. They came with one wick. We thought, well, if we've got water, maybe we could put another wick out and add more water and get bigger plants. So we put in a study to do that. We also added in that same study a fertilizer treatment. Never had much success with fertilizers, at least chemical fertilizers in my research, but I think water's always been limited. So here we don't have, maybe water's not limited. We could see a benefit from the fertilizer. We also, maybe this is my laziness, but put in a study to see if we could just put the water boxes on the soil surface. It's tough to dig in these rocky conditions to bury a seedling, let alone bury a box into the ground too. And I've got a little slide or video here. Maybe I do. It's not playing. See how talented Kevin is.
Yeah, we will. Oh, I got it.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. So you see the students at work and running that auger on that steep hillside. Oh, it's tough. So we, could we just put the water box on the surface? So then the first study, the design randomized block, we had in a block, just basically 2 seedlings without a water box and 2 seedlings with a water box, and then 10 blocks planted in November and May. And 3 of the blocks, we measured soil moisture underneath the seedlings. Those other studies set up similar with 8 blocks. And in these other 2 studies, they're planted in May with curl-leaf mountain mahogany. So let's first start off with our moisture that we received, as it's highly important. And as everyone knows, it's been dry over the last few years. Starting in 2020, when we put in the study, you'll note dry winter, dry spring, dry summer. 2021, also extremely dry, but we did get a good rain in August and then again late in the fall. So that did help out. Here's looking at soil moisture underneath those water boxes. When we installed those sensors, it's going in rocky soil. We got freeze thaw action going on. I don't know that we had contact, but come spring, seems like those sensors had settled down. And you'll see water potential in blue for WaterBoxxes and red as our control. And you can see at each of those depths, more water in the soil, and the rate at which it dries down as well is much less than the control. So they were adding water into the soil, and even down to 40 centimeters, which was exciting. Now looking at survival as that big long data set in the middle, and then vigor of those seedlings that survived to the end of the study. The top, looking right in the middle graph there, we're looking at survival. The top species is four-winged saltbrush, and that one just did well without a WaterBoxx, pretty drought tolerant. Going down, curly-leaf mountain mahogany. So in the fall planting, it also did well. But then in the spring, we see benefit substantially from the WaterBoxx and doubling survival. Benefit from pinyon pine. We see benefit from bitterbrush. And then again, with smooth sumac, the species down on the bottom. So 4 out of the 5 species had a benefit from the WaterBoxx. And looking at our next study, I apologize, there's a lot of data on this graph here, but we're looking at here the effect of fertilizer, the effect of a 1-wick or a 2-wick WaterBoxx, and then just planting seedlings. And let's start at the bottom of this graph. We're looking at survival over time, and the bottom, or the worst treatment, was fertilizer. Just fertilizer alone dropped survival right off the bat. Then the next is that those open circles is the control, and we can see how started off good, but quickly a lot of mortality. But with the WaterBoxxes, we see improved survival across the board, and it seemed like 2-wicks, at least on average, was doing better. I think it's a little easier to read if we look at vigor, though. Again, fertilizer, not much of a treatment response, but when we look at vigor, with the 2-wick WaterBoxx, that's the treatment that was statistically greater than our control. And then could we be a little lazy and throw the WaterBoxx on the soil surface? No, it looks like it needs to be buried. We've got improved survival and improved vigor there. So what's our take-home message from this study? Well, the WaterBoxx seems to work well for most species. And I liked especially how we could plant in the spring, and it's got us thinking, well, maybe we could even go into the summer, which would be really nice if we had a large window at which we could install seedlings. Adding an extra wick in our system seemed to work well. Maybe in a drier environment, you wouldn't want to do that. Wetter environment, maybe you could add more wicks. Again, the WaterBoxx should be buried. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about just the logistics a little more, to install these seedlings in the rocky soil with the WaterBoxxes. That was a challenge. I think if this were to be done on large scale, you'd need equipment, or a lot more students too. Also works well. So, but a final point, we're doing other research, like with Gamble's oak, and then we've got this study going on in a tailings. A tractor, a furrower to make a trench, and that was super easy. To have that trench, we could throw the seedlings in, and we planted 500 seedlings in a day here in this photo, versus that took us a solid week on the rock dumps. So. Interesting technology. I think it has application in certain areas where you have the funding and willpower to make it work. So that'll take questions. Oh yeah, great question. So we paid $25 a piece for ours. I think if you bought more, it would be cheaper. As far as removal, the idea is you could leave them on for a year or 2 years. If you wait too long, the plant can get too big and it's difficult to remove. Groasis sells some that are biodegradable, so you could just put them in and leave them as well. So Yeah, great question. We've thought about for some of ours, maybe leaving them longer. We just left them for a year and then pulled them.
All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking a lot about sagebrush. We're going to bring in the forestry aspect of it now, and we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Nelson.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be at this meeting here. Today, I'm up at the University of Idaho. I'm in the Department of Forest, Rangeland, and Fire Sciences. And I specialize mostly on the forestry side of things. So you're going to hear a little bit about trees today, up in northern Idaho. And these are just some of my co-authors, postdocs, and colleagues on the various projects I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about two projects, one with trees and then one where we've been dabbling a little bit with sagebrush seedlings. And the focus is really on drought conditioning and trying to engineer seedlings to survive in a drier world, and doing that at the nursery phase before the seedlings get planted on the outplanting site and hopefully increase survival. So I don't think I need to go into what the consequences of drought are across the Western US and what the trends are. You know, I think we all kind of know that it's becoming a big issue. It has been a big issue, and we're putting plants out into this environment and they are having to deal with lack of water on the sites. And we see it across the Great Basin, and we see it definitely up in the forested region of northern Idaho and the interior, what we call the interior Northwest forests. And we maintain a pretty large database of tree measurements across various site productivity gradients in northern Idaho. And so we're able to track how seedlings perform in drought years versus no drought years. And that left-hand figure in the upper left is just, you know, kind of our background mortality patterns that occur in recently planted seedling plantations, forest plantations, where survival usually hums around 10% within the first year. From a variety of factors, this does not include animal damage or anything like that. That's just seedlings that we find that are dead in the field, and that could be due to improper microsites or just poor seedling quality from the nursery. And it carries over into the second year, and the mortality is still a little bit less than 10%. We were, I guess, fortunate to have 2021 to be able to see how it changes under a drought year, which is the upper right-hand figure, where we planted a bunch of seedlings across multiple different sites, and you could just see the differences in the mortality. Instead of being less than 10%, the first year mortality was, you know, generally 30% and above. And that starts to approach a point where you start to consider whether or not the stand needs to be replanted after the mortality, just because of the widespread failure of the plantations, because most of these are industrial plantations that are being managed for timber harvesting. And, you know, we also saw a delayed effect, which are the gray bars there. So that was the black bars are the effects of the drought. And there was this delayed mortality that occurred a year later. And then the lower left-hand figure is just showing what happens when seedlings grew well with water the first year and then no drought. And then the second year, that mortality pulse. So still pretty sensitive. And it was just, yeah, it was a widespread. And so this is becoming an issue, you know, for all planting projects, really. And so the literature is not that great on drought conditioning. It's a technique that most nurseries do perform, usually at the end of the growth phase as we're trying to harden off plants. It's a cultural technique that we use, but it's generally a moderate amount of stress that gets imposed on the seedlings. And it's usually only at the hardening phase operationally. And so a lot of what we do research wise is we try to test those boundaries of what we can do from a nursery perspective and try to harden off seedlings either earlier in the growing season under different intensities of drought. So we manipulate the timing, the intensity, and the duration of the drought, and it changes the physiology and hopefully the overall morphology and the quality of the seedlings that can get planted. So we did this with Western larch, which is a native conifer species for northern Idaho. And this is a big study where we had different seed sources, genetic sources that we were able to obtain from interior British Columbia and then northern Idaho. So there's an interest-specific aspect to this study as well. And then the control treatment in all these studies is usually just run-of-the-mill what we would do in an operational nursery. And most nurseries are going to grow plants under relatively high water conditions and then harden them off at the end by dropping down the water. And so that's usually what our controls are. And then we had a moderate treatment that imposed some moderate drought stress starting in the middle of the growing period instead of at the end. And then we had an extreme one, which is the low one there. So every single one of those trays in that picture there have pin flags, and you can see how we manipulated the morphology of the seedlings by how you can see the pin flags. So under the low treatments, you can see the pin flags, so they're shorter, and the control ones were much taller. At the end of the phase, you can see in that upper left-hand picture what the seedlings look like when we went to go pack them at the end across that gradient from control to low. And the big emphasis of this project with the Western larch was on roots, because we know that new root production leads to survival of seedlings once they get put into the field. And so if we produce healthy root systems in the nursery, hopefully that leads to better survival. And so we wanted to know what drought does to the roots. And so we just in that picture there where the high moisture versus the low moisture, we see very different root morphologies. These are just lateral roots that came off of a taproot on the seedling, a single lateral root. And under the high moisture regime, we see what we call less root fibrosity, so less branching. The roots tended to be larger in diameter, but the overall total length was much lower, and we see a lot more active root tips when we grow it under low moisture regimes, which should hopefully lead to greater root production once they get planted in the field. We did some simulated testing of new root production. So that's at the end of the nursery phase. Then we pack the seedlings, they go into a freezer, then we pull them out of the freezer, and then we wake them up, and then we get them to grow new roots in these mist chamber systems. And then we do it for 16, I think we did the Western larch for 20 days. And we just see that the drought stress seedlings produce a significantly more amount of new roots under optimal conditions. So that was somewhat promising. We did do an outplanting. As I had mentioned, this was 2021 when this project went in, which was quite possibly the worst year to put any type of experiment in the ground, at least up where we were. It was a massive drought, which was good to test the drought conditions. But what we didn't harden the seedlings off was for the heat dome that hit in mid-June. At the end of June, up in the Pacific Northwest, our field planting site 5 feet above the ground hit 105 degrees, which means down where the seedlings were was probably 115 to 120 degrees at the ground level. So we saw a significant amount of heat damage on the seedlings, on the foliage, which essentially neutralized any type of drought response. We do have, there's a whole other component where we looked with coastal Doug fir, and then our colleagues in Purdue worked with black walnut, and those results are forthcoming. It's all about the new root growth. So we were working in these controlled facilities. This is a CT scanner where we can look at the 3-dimensional expression of the roots following a simulated outplanting. And you can see that in the right-hand picture, all those new roots that are growing out from these different drought treatments. And we can map those new roots and get a variety of different metrics that come off of it: rooting depth and root tips and root length and vertical root distribution. Okay, so that's kind of what we've been doing with tree seedlings. And it's been really interesting. There's this whole underlying physiological aspect to the studies as well, where we try to link the physiology and some of the stuff that Jeremy had talked about with the xylem anatomy to the performance of the seedlings and what we're doing to manipulate them. One of my grad students, Thomas McDonough, started this study a few years ago, which was with basin big sagebrush that we collected from Rinker Rock Creek Ranch in down around here in Idaho. And we originally started off with 3 different subspecies, but the other 2 failed. And so we were left with basin big sagebrush. And we dropped these things down to pretty low moisture percentages in the nursery. The initial study that we did, we weren't going low enough on the moisture regime. And so we had to come up with a new regime to actually induce a stress response, which is that 10 to 20% moisture within the plug. That, for context, if you pull a seedling out of a container and it feels like dust, that's about 10 to 20% moisture within a container. So it's pretty dry. And we were able to see this really nice physiological response with photosynthesis on the left, and then the what we call plant moisture stress or xylem water potential on the right, where lower moisture led to more stressed plants. So that's great. And then at the end of it, so we had these initial treatments, and then we went into this reciprocal drought cycle of treatments. So we took the ones that grew at high water and we exposed them to low water, and we took the ones at low water and exposed them to high water, and all the different combinations of it. At the very end of the growth cycle, so the plants were still active when this happened, and what the result was is that the seedlings that grew under high water, once they were exposed to drought, which is that March extreme, they just essentially shut down. The photosynthesis went negative, the stomata closed, and their plant water potential went extremely low, almost approaching -4 megapascals. If a tree reached -4, it would be dead. Sagebrush can go pretty low and still respond back. And then what we typically, what we do know and what we typically do in nurseries is we vernalize seedlings. We put them into cold storage and it forces them into a dormancy cycle, and then we can plant them out in the field. And so we wanted to simulate what was going to happen there. And so we put them through a vernalization and then another reciprocal drought to simulate a post-planting drought condition. And the control seedlings did a little bit better, and there was really no difference in terms of photosynthesis. Where we saw the big difference was in the plant water stress. So those control seedlings still, just kind of tanked, whereas the extreme ones seem to be able to withstand those dry conditions. So I think it's pretty promising what we're seeing with some of this drought conditioning work. Obviously, all these results depend on what the outplanting conditions are going to be. And there's a variety of factors on outplanting sites which influence whether or not these treatments are going to be successful. And so we're still at mostly at the research stage of this. Nurseries don't like to drought stress too much because it produces ugly looking plants. And Jeremy touched on this. It's about fitness for purpose and quality, not necessarily what it looks like. And a lot of people still base their planting preferences on what seedlings look like. And so it's going to take us, some time to rethink through what a quality plant actually looks like for planting conditions. So these are just the funding sources and folks that provided stuff. So with that, I think I have some time for questions. So he was asking about lumber quality, and likely not. Most of those defects are, what we see at the seedling stage. By the time the trees get to 40, 70 years old, you're not going to see it anymore. It's all about engineering the seedlings initially just to get them to create roots and to establish on the site.
All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Matthew Germino. And again, I'll let him introduce his topic. So
thank you very much. I normally don't get too nervous giving talks, but those are some tough acts to follow. Really great session so far. And hopefully I can keep up the pace here. But I want to take a step back here and look at the big picture of planting versus seeding and think about the environmental factors that affect the overall success in recovering sagebrush populations. That's our end goal, right? We have these techniques that help us get there. I want to point out right now, before I forget, that everything I'm about to present to you is retrospective. And I know there's a lot of people in this room who've been working on these problems for many years. And because of that, you've been in your career for a while, and you're probably looking at your IRAs and the old saying that the past is no predictor of the future is something that you can resonate with, right? It's the same thing with outplanting and restoration success. The techniques are changing quite a bit every year. And in my opinion, our overall success rates are probably actually increasing, albeit slowly over time. And so again, I want to emphasize everything I'm about to present to you is retrospective. Okay. So I'd like to acknowledge our team, our research team here. Let's see if I can get them. Everybody in this room knows that the trump card for restoration success is aligning your treatments with good weather. That's also hard to forecast. The forecasting tools that are available now online are remarkably good. And so that can help with that. In the right place. So I'm going to talk a lot about spatial factors that affect success. Using the right seedbed preparation. Competition from herbaceous is super important. Using the right insertion technique. And that's, I think, what we're going to talk a lot about today. That's where you wanted us to go, right, Kevin? Using the right stewardship. And Kirk hit on this. How you graze after a restoration treatment is just, it's an example of one thing that can really make or break the worst or the best of initial restoration investments. So here's the outline. First, I'm going to talk about a paper that I was peripherally involved on, but ended up as a co-author. It was led by Dave Pike and others, and they evaluated planting versus seeding success over many plots all around the Great Basin. What can we learn from that? There's some compromises in spatial extent, what you can learn versus when you focus on individual landscapes where you might be able to sample a lot more intensely and reduce a lot of the uncertainty associated with the restoration treatments. And so number 2 and number 3 here, we'll drill into the Soda wildfire area, which is nearby here, to take a more detailed focused look on recovery. And before I get too much further, I also want to emphasize the typical management targets for success on the bottom row. So we're told by wildlife specialists that they want to have about 1 plant per 10 meters squared. Maybe that varies for different projects in order to meet the requirements of species like greater sage grouse, who eat sagebrush during the winter as their sole food source. And also we've heard 15% cover of sagebrush and sagebrush that are 30 centimeter tall. So those are some nominal things we can keep in mind. So the first study here you can see this map showing all of the plots that were evaluated by the team. Blue is seeded, red is planted. I think I have that right. Unfortunately, because this is retrospective, there's some uncertainty in whether the subject plants that were measured were truly the ones that were planted or ones that came up from seed or were volunteers. So you can't get around that. I think the crew did a really good job of trying to, get this right, but there's inevitably some uncertainty. Some Bayesian statistics I won't get too much into, but let's look at the important outcomes here. So we're looking at height, whether seeded, whether planted. Low R&R, that stands for resistance and resilience class. So those are the aeritic mesic soils, pretty dry, pretty warm. Whereas on the right, high R&R, that's that might be frigid, xeric sorts of soils, much wetter, higher elevation, think mountain big sagebrush. You notice here the years to meet the minimum goals of 30 centimeter height and 15% canopy area are about a year faster when you plant. So you achieve your goal approximately at like 3 years, whereas if you seed, you might get those objectives met by 4 years. So you get about a year advance. What about area? Somewhat fewer differences between seeding and planting, but generally similar. Take-home message, planting does, no surprise to you. And I would think, personally, my opinion is that planting is likely to get you the desired sagebrush recovery quicker. That's my nominal working hypothesis. But here, what we're finding is that it's only about a year advantage, and 8 years later, that advantage has really waned. And actually, your seeded plants are about 20 centimeters taller, that's significant, and have considerably more canopy area than the planted. Again, I emphasize these are retrospective findings. Now, let's go into the Soda wildfire area. So burned in 2015, right along the Idaho-Oregon border, about 280,000 acres. The BLM planted about 1 million seedlings. About half of those were planted in the initial year. And Bill Davidson, please raise your hand, right here, did the heavy lifting of organizing a crew to go out and measure 3,000 of these plants This landscape has a lot of variability in it, many different soil types, many different co-treatments, wide range in elevations. So it's a magnificent study area, in my opinion. Lots to be learned from it. So on 57 belt transects, those were our unit of evaluation here, replication. We characterized the vegetation community, marked all the seedlings. There was no ambiguity as to whether or not a seedling was planted or seeded or volunteer, because we knew the treatment so well. We looked at the tissue on these plants to evaluate what type of subspecies. At the time of this, there was actually, frankly, a little bit of controversy about what types of plant material were being planted out. Okay. We had the advantage of being able to sample the foliage to get an idea of the taxonomic identity of these plants. So leaf length to width ratios. Well, first of all, we're told basin big sagebrush has long leaves. Well, all sagebrush have long leaves. They're all long and slender, sorry. But what we know in our shop is certain ratios of length to width that we know genetically match up with Wyomingensis, a little stouter, versus tridentata versus mountain big sagebrush, somewhere in the middle. We can combine that with cytotype, whether or not you're 1 or 2 cytochrome copies or gene copies, and UV fluorescence also matters. So the results, first of all, there was containerized and bare root plants, okay? Containerized plants, unsurprisingly, had much greater size and survivorship than the bare roots, okay? And the factors affecting outplant survival, there was actually pretty good outplant survival, but less so in areas that had really high burn severity. Steep slopes, lots of annual grasses, and also too little or too much perennial grasses. We oftentimes think of sagebrush recovery as having a monotonic relationship to grasses. Well, when you do lots of sampling, like we do in my shop, it's curvilinear, at least initially. This is initial survival. Later, things change. So as the plants get older, the factors that are affecting success differ. The most striking result here, the strongest factor, was something that is kind of invisible on the landscape. When you look across these basins, you don't really notice that there's different soil types. But if you look at the soil mapping units provided to us from NRCS, you look at where the outplants were most successful. Those outplants were selecting soils that were relatively deep and did not have restrictive layers. That was by far the strongest factor. Genetic identity of the plant, I'm going to gloss over this. Surprisingly little effect. So there was maybe some mountain big sagebrush mixed in. Basin big sagebrush types appear to be planted in Wyomingensis types. That didn't really matter as much as all these landscape factors, especially soil type. Now, how about let's look 5 years later. Let's compare the success of those outplants compared to the seedings. Tons of sampling done on this, shown in that map. So number 1 here on that left column, we're looking at dryness, top row, middle row, elevation, bottom row, slope. You can see, first off, planting plus seeding gives you a lot more success compared to only seeding on the right. Okay, so combinations of treatments, and obviously, unsurprising, wetter areas at higher elevations that are a little less steep had much greater success when you planted and seeded, especially if you seeded multiple times. What about biotic factors? Litter cover, surprisingly, more litter. That's ironic. We can talk about this. More litter actually was associated with more survivorship. Also, presence of fertile islands, reinforcing what Kirk talked about. Unsurprisingly, more success. Here, now you can start to see 5 years later, perennial grasses in that third row are looking to have something that reflects a competitive interaction. Exotic annual grass cover, again, negative. Planting, seeding twice in the middle there, much the desired, going above the desired threshold for establishment, good deal. So combining treatments. Synthesis. Planting gives you small initial gains, but in the long run, that seeding probably is still something we need to think about doing. Now we know some natural landscape factors that control success. We can leverage those and plan where we seed. We can devise equipment that is suited to hit these particular landscape characteristics. So some ideas for you. And I saw this in Homedale, which is in West Valley here. We're not the first people to think about technologies for plantings. I'm sure if Steve Monsen was here, he'd probably be able to tell us stories about this particular device right here that's on Main Street in Homedale, Idaho. Thank you. Again, to reiterate, in our study, which by the way was imperfect in its ability to test taxonomy, but nonetheless a pretty good test, not perfect, but good. Those landscape factors, especially soil type, are much more. Right, and so I did not present long-term data, which is needed to look at reproduction. And we've published a paper which shows that there can be problems downstream in reproduction, even with the best of plant materials and things like that. And those, there could be, so your point is very well taken. Important caveat here. Adaptation may really bear its impact in the long run. And when I say long run, I mean 10, 20, 30 years downstream. Would we consider arbuscula low sagebrushes on those shallower soils? And I will say that a lot of it's hard when you're doing these mass seedings or plantings to deal with that particular thing. I think it's getting better in the agencies, the land agencies, but retrospectively, my sense is that there wasn't as much precision in getting low sagebrushes where they belong.
Okay, our last presenter is Dr. Scott Jensen from the Rocky Mountain Research Station Shrub Lab. He contracted COVID, so he's going to be remote.
Well, it's been a great session so far. I wish I could be there in person with you. I'm glad there was a lot of the introductory information that was covered previously, so I'm actually going to skip a few slides. But I want to touch first just on the partnership involved in this project. So I'm going to talk today about designing the target plant, and Jeremy did a great job covering that target plant concept as an introduction anyway. And a wildland transplanter for rapid plant-based sagebrush restoration. So this project really came about as Robbie Edgell, who's a biologist with the Utah Division of Wildlife, had a need to reestablish sagebrush on big game winter ranges. He began working with Tom Glass of High Country Nursery to develop a stock type that gave him good success. And then we've had a lot of other folks participate in this. Some contractors who do most of the planting for us. EcoPoint built a transplanter and tested that. And then Dan Fletcher and Randall Violet are helping out, are allowing us to piggyback on a larger sagebrush study they had down in the southern part of the state. So we're grateful for that. And funding for this project has come from the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative and a couple of sportsmen's groups, Sportsmen's for Fish and Wildlife, the Mule Deer Foundation, and then the U.S. Forest Service and the Great Basin Native Plant Project. So this is representative of the sites that the state is interested in putting sagebrush back on. This is big game winter range, primarily mule deer winter range. And you can see there that most of the sagebrush has been lost to this. And in most cases, the reason for that, the primary reason for that is these were seeded with competitive perennial grasses years ago. And those perennial grasses are competitive enough that they've not allowed the sagebrush to reestablish itself. So as these canopies mature, rather than reseeding and getting some continuity, the grasses are out competing any reestablishing plants, and we're converting it to grasslands. So what we're talking about today is transplanting plants, and there's been a lot of good discussion about that. Typically, when we think about restoring sagebrush, I think most of our minds goes to broadcasting seed aerially, just by virtue of the volume of scale that is impacted by fire in the region. That's the most practical approach. But in order to be successful, if we're going to do it on a plant-based approach, there have to be a lot of efficiencies that we can incorporate. And this includes integrating everything from the greenhouse all the way up through volumes of seed, and then automating the process to make it all faster. So the work I'm going to talk about today is intent to try to improve efficiencies in a number of those areas. This is just a part of the study that I'm presenting data on today. And these transplants occurred in the fall of 2021 and in the spring of 2022. And primarily we're looking at 3 locations with this portion of the data set. And these are all in central Utah, from Wallsburg down to Santaquin and up Spanish Fork Canyon at Dairy Fork. We've got between 1 and 4 planting methods, and the planting methods are different mechanical ways of putting a hole in the ground, essentially. We're looking at between 5 and 7 different container sizes of plants that were grown, and then plants that were grown to 3 different ages. There were 2 or 3 different vegetative treatments, a control, a glyphosate treatment, and a divot treatment. This is what a divot treatment looks like here, to provide some additional control of the vegetation right around the planting site. And then at the spring planting date, we also had 3 extended planting dates. Our initial plant was within a week of snow coming off these sites. And in 2022, that was March 29th. Then we waited 3 weeks, planted again, waited another 3 weeks and planted a 3rd time. So our hypothesis regarding all these variables revolve around water availability. So this graphic on the right, I'm assuming you can see my cursor over here. I sure hope so. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough conversation. The graphic on the right. So you can see it, Kevin?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Indicates that the blue line here indicates that there's no plant stress. This is water deficit. So early in the year, the ground is typically frozen, and this value is for 0 to 6 inches. So the water is not really available to plants. So at this point in time, there was probably a rain event that melted the snowpack to some extent. It penetrated the ground, got some freeze or a little bit of loss of that frost, some freeze thaw action for the next little bit. And then we got another large rain event where the remainder of the snow on the soil was all melted. It saturated the soil profile. You start to get temperatures that are warm enough that the plant can grow. And as the season progresses, the soil dries out. You get to a point where there's plant stress, and the plant is in our cases are going dormant at that point. So of course, what we expect is that these darker colors on this graph are shallower depths of the soil, 2 inches and 4 inches. And then the lighter colored lines are deeper down in the soil, 20 and 40 inches. So as we would expect, there's a lot of volatility in the soil moisture at the shallower depths. But that once you reach about 20 inches at this location, this is in Ephraim, Utah, the soil moisture is relatively stable. So our thought is if we can get a plant to root down 20 inches, it's got a fairly good chance of survival. So initially we felt like relative to the different planting methods, and we'll show these here in a moment, we felt the auger is kind of the standard, and we felt it would probably yield the best results, followed by a punch style, and then followed by a spindle. The Hodad is only incorporated with the smallest plants, not across the rest of the container sizes. We felt that the largest volume plant would probably yield better survival than the smallest plant, and the tallest plant, tallest container, would also yield better survival than the shortest, just by virtue that you're 3 or 4 inches ahead of approaching that 20-inch depth of stable moisture. And then we felt the oldest age plants were more likely to yield better survival than the younger age plants. Understanding that competition is important, we felt the glyphosate treatment would give us our best survival, followed by the divot and followed by the control. And then we felt the early planting date would get those plants out and give them the best opportunity to recover from transplant shock and utilize that early soil moisture. And subsequent planting dates would progressively dry out, and we would have poorer survival as a result of that. So here's an example of one of the planting methods that was incorporated. This is an AMS probe. So in this case, the probe itself is hollow in the center. As it punches a hole in the ground, it pops out a core. And it's operated by a little Honda hydraulic motor in the back, and it's got a hammer action with about this was modified from its original configuration. I think they're running about a 15-pound head now. So you can pretty well put a hole through anything you want in the landscape. This was everybody's favorite tool to use. The next is the typical auger. This one's mounted on the front of a track hoe. The challenge here is typically the augers that are available are larger in diameter than any plant that we'd really use. You end up with a hole that's considerably oversized that then has to be filled in, and it tends to slow the planting rate quite a bit. And then the third tool that was used is a power harrow. So power harrow is like a rototiller, except that rather than horizontal tillage, you have vertical tillage. So we replaced the tillage bars and installed spindles that were the same diameter as the contour of the container. And you can see that these rotate. And then you just lift the tractor up and down with the 3-point hitch to punch a hole in the ground. This was our preferred method after using it quite a bit. We really found favor with this method. At this location, this is up at the Bear River Birds of Prey. Typically, they use an auger on the front of a skid steer, and they spend a day to 2 days out punching holes. And then they invite a bunch of dedicated hunters or other sportsman groups to come out and plant. And they'll spend 2 days to do about 1,000 plants. This day, we did 1,000 plants in 2 hours. So it was quite a bit faster than what they've been able to do in the past. So let's look at some of our survival data. This is early on. We're just a year into this process so far. So initially, we're going to talk about the fall 21 plant and the status of those plants a year later. So overall survival across 3 different sites range from about 75 to 85%. Historically, some survival data from a number of different publications shows that 35 to 40%, this tends to be about the high, with occasions where 85% survival is pretty good. These are probably in Wyoming sites where we're up in a mountain sagebrush sites. We would expect survival to be better at our higher elevations. Interestingly, though, across all these sites, 2/3 of the mortality occurred over winter, with only 1/3 occurring during the summer period. My expectation was that we wouldn't have much overwinter mortality, but most of our mortality would occur during that dry summer period, but that's not at all what we saw at this site. And of those plants that didn't make it through the winter, they just failed to grow any root whatsoever. So that plant didn't even make it through the winter. Let's visit for a bit about herbicide treatment. So this is a fall planting. Fortunately, there was a little bit of green up that fall, and we sprayed Roundup over the top of that plot. You can see what they look like. It was a very effective control, but in terms of productivity, it didn't have much of effect. The control versus the spray plots were similar at the Wallsburg site and relatively similar at the Santaquin site, with about a 5% benefit to the spray site at Dairy Fork. What was observed, though, and we didn't collect data on this, it'll be collected in spring, is the size of the plant and whether it produced seed or not. And this is a plant that was planted fall of 21, so a year later, fall of 22. Many of the plants in the spray plot produced seed the first year. How about planting method? The auger versus our hydraulic versus our power harrow. Essentially, it didn't matter. We got effectively almost the same establishment regardless of how we put a hole in the ground. Interestingly, this little guy right here is called a 288 plug. It's about 1.25 inches tall by 1/2 inch large. We had some empty spots in the design. So in the spring or the fall of that year, we also planted these as well and just put them in the ground with a hodad and achieved 42% survival, surprisingly, with that tiny little plant. This is a busy graph, but it's got a lot of great information on it. This is survival by the container size and age. And let me first point out that the 288 is up here. We just talked about that, 42% survival for the first year with that tiny little plug. The D40 is a plug that the nursery had built, and they were having really good success with. But those plants weren't grown as part of this trial. In order to fill a D40 pot, they've got to be grown for a longer period of time. So we used a plant in this case that was grown under a different set of circumstances than the remainder of the plants. And then here, the colored boxes capture the different plug sizes. So in this case, we've got a D16 plug. Shoot, I just realized in one of my early slides, I took off the picture of what the different containers look like. I apologize for that. 16 is 16 cubic inches. This is 25 cubic inches. This is about 8 cubic inches. We've got 10 cubic inches and 7 cubic inches down here. The important thing to note is that every container had at least one age and container size that exceeded 90% survival. The youngest age class, represented by these yellow circles, that's unfortunately been shifted, always had the poorest survival. So these were 3-month-old plants. Why would we want a 3-month-old plant to plant that out? Well, interestingly enough, it matches the budget cycle of the state. They get new money in August. So if they can start a plant in August and plant it out in mid-October, mid-November, they can utilize this year's money. So the poorest survival was 64% and up to 80% survival on a 3-month-old plant, which is pretty intriguing. It looks like for the larger size classes that the added time to growth was still beneficial, as these are essentially the same, but this on the 16s. But on the 25 cubic inch pot, that added growth time, a 9-month-old plant, had a little bit better survival than the 7-month-old plant. But as we look at the smaller containers, the 8, the 10, and the 7 cubic inch, it appeared that holding the plant for the extra 2 months resulted in a little bit poor survival. So we turned the table there in some factor, and the 7-month-old plant for the smaller container sizes were always the best. Okay, let's look now at the spring 22 planting and the status of those plants in the fall. So across the sites, our spring survival was considerably poorer than the fall planted survival. The Santaquin site was essentially the same, whether it was planted in the spring or fall. Both Dairy Fork and Wallsburg saw poor survival with spring planting. Relative to vegetative treatment, so the spindle is just our control. This is what a divot looks like. So we've designed a tool that creates a tapered edge from surface level down to about 3 inches deep to remove the competition right around the plant. And then here on the right, you can see what the effect of the herbicide was on the grasses. So generally, we saw the spindle treatment added about 4% improvement in persistence survival versus the spindle alone or just the transplant alone. But the real take-home message there was that the herbicide treatment offered the best improvement in survival. Okay. Let me just bump right here and go to some golden nuggets. So the fall planting date gave us 75 to 80% survival, which is better than the spring. 7-month-old plant was probably the best container. Herbicide was the best, and the planting method didn't matter. A hole was a hole was a hole, effectively. So our next steps are we've got soil moisture measurements in all of these, so we need to incorporate that data. The planting method that we like the best, we would like to automate, and we think we need we put this out to bid. It looks like we need about $250,000 for design, and then we want to jump into Wyoming sites. Just one more brief comment on this. We did a larger scale planting down in Cedar City. We planted 20,000 plants, and with some modifications to that tool, we were able to plant at about 2,000 plants an hour. So that's 2,000 plants an hour. So we're excited about the possibility of automating the transplanting process, and I'll stop with that.
I think we'd all agree it's been a great session. We run into lunch. I would say if people want to stay, we can keep Scott on for a few minutes. If speakers want to stay for a few minutes and talk questions, but we will have a campfire session at 1 o'clock down in the junior ballroom. Just